Hello, everyone. I'm Gaipo. Thanks for tuning in to my talk here at DevSecOn. Really excited to be here. And I'm going to be digging into modern security and cloud-native AppSec in a bit. So hope you enjoyed the talk. So today we're going to talk about cloud-native application security. And it's a big term, and there's all sorts of ways in which we talk about modernizing security and such at DevSecOn. But really what I'm trying to do here is I'll try to give you slightly big picture mental model and maybe iterate some key principles that we can all take kind of on the journeys as we evolve security and application security maybe into sort of this new reality. Just a couple of words about me. I am the founder and president of Sneak, which you're probably familiar with, and I also host the Security Developer Podcast, where I get a chance to talk to all sorts of smart security leaders that are, oftentimes leading the charge around this type of practices. So I learned from kind of both of those journeys. And I've actually recently written a book with O'Reilly on this notion of cloud-native AppSec, and you can get a free copy of it. You have the link over there. And hopefully, that kind of goes into deeper detail of what I'll talk about today. So let's dig in, talk a little bit about the flow here. We're going to talk first about kind of setting the stage, about the context of digital transformation, and really mostly, again, around key principles that we can take along the journey when we think about adapting security to it. We'll dig into dev-first security and how that's not just a different way of saying shift left. We'll talk about cloud-native apps and how do we secure their entire scope. And then we'll dig into some of the transformation itself. So how do we adapt? What do we need to change to deal with it? Now, this is just sort of a 30-minute talk, so we're not going to go heavily deep into each of those. But again, we'll hopefully give a bit of a mental model and some concrete examples of sort of principles that you can try to follow as you go along. So diving in, let's start with digital transformation and adapting to it. So digital transformation is a big buzzword. It means different things to different people, but I think we'll all agree that it's real. It is a force that is happening right now in the world of technology, in the world of business, and that's the reason you hear digital transformation so often. It's because it's a very real and immediate need and focus area for a lot of businesses. And I'll talk about sort of three aspects of digital transformation and how they relate to security. The first one is that everyone wants to be a technology company. And if you work for a technology company already, for a software company, for a SaaS company, you think digital transformation, you probably are primarily focused on the next two elements about DevOps around cloud. But in many companies, in the banks, in the retailers, in really many, many different types of organizations, it's around shifting from a business that was primarily analog, was primarily in person or physical or such, into companies that really position themselves to be a digital company that does X, a digital company that does banking, a digital company that sells clothes, et cetera. And that's a significant shift. It brings with it all sort of technology investments and platform and how you build software, but predominantly it changes the center of gravity, maybe the weight that the company wants to give into their technology operations as compared to others. And with it, the center of gravity that the security aspects of that sort of digital footprint should have in comparison to the rest of the organization and kind of the practices that involves. From a security transformation perspective, what that really means is that as we go through this and we talk about principles, we talk about dev-first security and modern and cloud-native AppSec, there's oftentimes a tendency to say, hey, yeah, that's for the sort of the small and nimble SMB company that is kind of running along and moving fast. It doesn't really work for my kind of big conglomerate Fortune 100 company. And the reality is that it must, because digital transformation is trying to get all companies to operate to a degree as a technology company, as a modern company. And so as we go through these, remember that they might seem modern and fast and nimble, but really even the largest organizations are striving to work in this fashion. The second tip is around DevOps. And again, DevOps, you can write full dissertations on what DevOps is, but fundamentally, the model of DevOps revolves around independent teams. It's really around a small set of people who are able to catch the ball in one side of the court, run all the way to the other side, score, and do that again and again and again. And the tighter that loop, the faster that iteration, the better the business does. And that's important because when we think about security, we should use that as a guiding factor. We should assess any solution that we try to devise for security on its ability to sort of fit this model, to have application teams that are building it be able to apply that security model, that security process, that security tool independently. And really, fundamentally, if they cannot, it won't work. It would go against the grain of every company wanting to be a technology company. This is especially important for security, which has a natural tendency of being much more centralized. And so thinking about it in this independent teams model is something that is a great, significant principle to keep in mind as you transform. And then the third element of digital transformation I'll highlight is the notion of cloud. And, again, words can be said, but fundamentally, cloud changes the scope of the application. In the pre-cloud era, an app was mostly some code and some libraries, and they were sitting on top of a big central IT stack that was centrally managed and provided databases and servers and networks and data centers. In cloud, these things have not just become virtual, they've become APIs. And they are invoked and managed through the repository. They're sort of naturally a part of the software development process. They are stored in some repo, they're applied through a build. And so they've become a part of the app, or rather the app has grown in scope to encompass these aspects. And so when we think about this, for security and for application security, it means we need to expand the scope of application security, because all the security concerns, all the decisions that these IT people were making about that sort of central stack to try and avoid unpatched servers, try and avoid misconfigured infrastructure, all of those have moved to become APIs, and those decisions are now being made by developers as part of their kind of repository and the files in there. And so we need to shift, and we need to think about application security in a broader scope that now encompasses these sort of full stack. So fundamentally, all of those combine into a need for a new approach to application security. It's still application security. We're still securing the app. That's what we're doing here. But we need to grow the scope to be cloud native application security, to include the full scope of cloud native apps. And we need to make it dev first to be able to adapt to these sort of independent team approach. So what does this mean? Let's sort of dig into two of those elements, the dev first and the cloud native. Start with dev first. So what's the difference? What's the meaning of applying security in a dev first fashion versus not? Before I dig into sort of specific examples, what I would say is the secret is in the name. Developer first security implies that you should start by asking, if I am a developer and I want to tackle a security risk, what is the optimal solution for me? Forget everything else. Forget all the other needs. Forget your own need if you're a security person, your own needs, and just say, what is the most important? What are sort of the attributes that are most important in the solution for a developer to be successful, and then build from there. That's the meaning of developer first. You first start with the developer's needs. So with that general philosophy, let me give you maybe 3 concrete tips that we can try to apply here. First is, what does a developer know and what does an auditor know? So kind of this context of developer versus auditor. And at a high level, developers understand the app. They know the app far better than the auditor does. They live and breathe the app. They've built parts of the app. They understand the functionality. While an auditor, they understand the risk. They've seen this attack. They've seen this vulnerability many a time. They understand what can happen with it. And that's the context. That's the world in which they approach the same bit of information, or they judge the same bit of information through. And the other way to think about it is, with that knowledge, when they zoom out, they see different things. When a developer zooms out, they have a security aspect of their application, and they zoom out, they see the application. They see the application with all its glory, all its moving parts, all of its performance issues, all of its resilience issues, all of its quality bugs. That's what they see. They understand it, and that's the lens through which they see the security problem as another aspect of the application. Well, for an auditor, when they zoom out, they see the whole risk. For this app, they see all the bad things, all the assets can be stolen. But actually, more often, they don't really think about just the app, because most auditors are not just looking at one app, they're looking across a portfolio. And so what they see is they see the same risk, the same cross-site scripting, or the same known vulnerability across apps. And this lens is very, very important. When you look at security solutions today, they heavily bias in favor of the Auditor product. They tend to default to showing you a vulnerability amidst a list of vulnerabilities. That's the zoom out. It's all the vulnerabilities from all the apps. Now you can kind of drill into them. They tend to just emphasize, in terms of the elements and the information provided, the risk that vulnerability or that sort of security defect represents. While for a developer, those are fine. They might cope with this, but that's not their primary lens. Their primary lens really is the application itself. So what they're seeking is, when they want more context, is how does this vulnerability relate to my application? Where does it sit in my application? And they might bias more towards trees of libraries. You sort of use this library, it use that other library, it use that other library. That last one is vulnerable. Great, now I know how it got into my system. And there are many examples of it. So when you think about developer-first security, you want to present solutions in a way that first and foremost highlights the place of that security issue within the application. The second, and this might come as a surprise, is that developers like developer tools. Generally, your security solution, my security solution, any security solution, it's not the only thing that the developer is using. In fact, far from it. They are using a myriad of tools, dozens, sometimes more tools in their daily lives. And those tools have an affinity. They work in a certain way. They are built in a whole methodology around being self-serve and easy to use. They have certain UX. They do that sort of application context we talked about before. They adhere to some common guidelines around kind of the developer experience, the DX versus UX, or as an aspect of UX. And on top of all of those, they relate to one another. They talk about contexts like a LAMP stack or many others. And so when you think about your solution and you think about a developer-first approach, and again, it doesn't really matter if it's a homegrown solution or something commercial or anything else, you want to walk and talk and quack like a developer tool. You want to model your solution on other solutions that the developers might be using. And that in turn would make it natural for a developer to use it. If you are building it, if you're modeling it like the vast majority of security solutions out there on an auditing tool, and you just try to shift it left to kind of plop it into the pipeline or into a repo or IDE, it's not going to feel natural for developers. Now, what I have here is a bit of a visual, which is everything I described right now sounds like I'm referring to just the product itself, the tech, the UX of the product. But in practice, when you think about developer tools, you should think holistically, especially if you're building a solution for a security solution for developers. You have to think about the go-to-market. Developers like to use before they buy. They like to start self-serve. And then when they see success, they like to grow and scale that. While security solutions tend to be much more sort of top-down, find some buyer and then roll it out across it. Developers like to start small and try it, and then with proven success grow, while security solutions tend to start in a centralized fashion and roll it out. And so if you want developers to embrace your solution, whether it's developers in your company or it is a solution that you're building, you want to think about developer tools. You want to model after developer tools. And this is a screenshot from the OpenView Dev Tooling GTM playbook, which is a great read that I recommend. And I actually just set this tooltip over here. And then the third and very, very important bit to remember is that security people audit and developers fix. And that's a very, very significant distinction. It's not a statement to the detriment of either party. An auditor's job primarily is to make us aware, make the company aware, make the developers aware of the security flaws in there and that are in the systems they're building, to provide platforms to help them find those issues, and then to ensure that those are logged and prioritized and captured in the right fashion. But a developer's job isn't those. Yes, they also need to find issues and they need to run it, but their primary job is to fix them. Their primary job is not to be aware of bugs. Their primary job is to fix the bugs. So there's a whole set of steps that go from a logged issue to a fixed issue. That's true security or otherwise. And it's amazing how many security solutions are out there, again, homegrown or commercial, that even state when they talk about fix, there's fix button, there's a remediation section where the remediation is logging a Jira ticket. Logging a Jira ticket is very important. It is not remediation. It is just that. It's logging a Jira ticket. It's logging a ticket instead of in a separate system in the development team system, which is better, but not sufficient. And so you want to think the whole journey, think through the whole journey in the homegrown or in the practice or in the process or in the commercial tools you're building. Think about how do you bring it all the way to actually fixing the problem, to actually helping a developer fix the problem. So all of those combine into a more meta perspective, which is when we think about dev for security, we need to remember that our goal isn't to shift left, as you see on the left of the screen here, somewhat ironically, isn't really around shift left, which is that's a great practice to shift left. It came from the waterfall practice. I was saying shift left back in 2002 when I was building kind of AppScan and AppShield back then, and the notion of shifting left is an efficiency play. It's around don't find the issues after you've deployed, find them early, find them as you design them, as you build them, as you code review them. And it's great, and it is indeed more efficient, but it's just not enough. Shifting left, taking the same audit you would have run late and running it early is really only a small piece of the problem, and it's not at all DevOps minded. It's just an efficiency play. The real change that we want is one of top to bottom. Today, development process is continuous. These teams need to own their entire journey. So they own the stuff that happens on the right and the stuff that happens on the left, that happens on the left. And really what you want them to do is you want them to own the security aspect of that journey successfully. And you want them to do that on the left, and you want them to do that on the right. And you really, ideally, you want them to decide when is the right time for them to run it, because you want them to own the risk, equipped with the right solutions to be able to address it. And so keep it in mind, shift left is great, but really the primary goal for this exercise is an ownership change. It's a top to bottom from a dictatorial sort of centralized security team that makes the decisions for everybody else to more of a democratized model in which these development teams are able to run with the right tools, with the right governance. They still need to be kind of monitored and tracked, but they need to be able to operate that security and make good judgment with sound judgment calls and build secure things on their own. So with that, let's talk about cloud. All of this was really dev for security, and you can say dev for security is adapting security to DevOps. Fundamentally, it's around adapting security to this model of independent teams, and those independent teams happen to be primarily developers, application developers. Cloud, as we talked about, requires us to sort of rethink a bunch of these IT security solutions into application security. So let's dig a bit more. As before, rethinking IT security into application security is not something I'm going to cover in sort of 5 minutes here for you. You have to dig deeper. Hopefully the book gives you a bit more information, but still there's more. It's more of a meta concept. But if I was to sort of give you 3 core anchors, the first element to it is to remember that your infrastructure is in your repo. So this statement today, you have a repository, it has the full stack, everything around it sits in that repository. Sometimes it's a neighboring repository, but your code, your open source manifest, and your container configuration, and your Helm charts, and oftentimes Terraform files, all of these things, they sit in the repository. What this means is that you have to rethink or start by thinking about tooling that work in the context of a repo, a pipeline. These are constraints and an advantage. So you want to think about where do you run your test? You should run it where possible, more like other application security solutions. So can you find a cloud security problem or a container security problem in the IDE? Can you find it when something got created in the repo? Can you find it in the build? The builds people are a bit more familiar with, but can you think about the fact that your infrastructure is in the repo? It means you will be well rewarded if you build solutions, if you build something that can actually find those problems when they are in the repo, when they are in development, local development, because that is that sort of shift left, that is that early detection versus finding it late. So you have to rethink, how do you secure an aspect of infrastructure when it was still the code that leads to that infrastructure? And by saying infrastructure, I mean all these layers that are below code here. And I think I'll to kind of try and bring it home, I'll give two examples, one for container security and one for infrastructure as code, of how you could do this. So for example, for container security, a good example of it is separating out base image. When you try to rethink container security from a dev first angle, you can say that the distinction in how the base image is managed is very, very big. From an auditor perspective, the base image doesn't really matter. You have a container image, it has a bunch of files in it. Some of those are vulnerable artifacts. You audit the image, you find a bunch of vulnerabilities, and that's kind of the end of the story. You found a vulnerability, you go off to assess the risk. That's the risk mentality. I don't really care where it came from. I care that the vulnerability is there. For a developer, it's night and day, whether a vulnerability came from a base image or whether it came from the Docker file. To an extent, if it's in the base image, it's an upgrade exercise. Okay, I need to take the newer version of the base image or swap it. If it's in the Docker file, it's in my code. I actually created it over there. There's a code change that I need to do. So that's sort of one example of rethinking container security into dev first. Again, one of many. Another example is in infrastructure as code. Skipping slide here. So in infrastructure as code, you can think about what is the continuation of the information you provide. So say you scanned a Terraform file and you found a vulnerability. You found kind of some mistake. You've done it well. You've done it in the repo or in the pipeline. If you're a developer, the next question is, where is this in my app? Like, which functionality does it touch? So that I would know, if I make this stricter, if I change the user, if I do that, would I break the app? From an auditor perspective, you go down a very different route. You go down the route of risk. You go down the route of saying, okay, so I have this. Like, does it matter which data assets are exposed? Should I ring the alarm bell? Both are legitimate perspectives, but they are very, very different. So you want to think about your solution and where does it guide the developer? If you gave a developer the auditor perspective, they will not be successful. So this is probably a good point to say, I'm not dissing the security perspective. Security people are critical to all of our success. You know, some of my best friends are security people. You know, it's super, super critical to keep the organization secure, that you have that risk perspective. All I'm saying is it's not going to get you developer adoption. So the mistake happens when you build an auditor tool and you give it to developers and you expect them to successfully use it. That's the piece that I'm saying would not happen. So we just went through, you know, the general kind of pillars of digital transformation. We talked about developer first security and how to sort of maybe some tips around how do you adapt to it. Talk about cloud native AppSec and how do you want to sort of rethink some of these IT security controls as a dev first application security approach. Maybe just before we wrap up, 2 or 3 items about how do you adapt a little bit more broadly as an organization into this world, right? How do you rethink AppSec into CNAS as a security org? What should you consider? So the first thing to consider is the security organization itself. When you envision this reality in which developers own a lot of security, that means the job of the security person is different. It means, if I look at the right, that they are no longer meant to audit. You know, it's not the security team's job to find vulnerabilities and to, you know, log them and to do all of that, because that won't scale. That's precisely what we've been doing and have been in this independent team model running into a blocker. What you need is that same team to build solutions, to provide, whether they bought or they built, doesn't really matter, to provide solutions to the developers so the developers can do those audits themselves as a natural part of their development process, so they can find those vulnerabilities. So it means within the team, you're going to need less auditing skills and more engineering skills, more platform building skills. This is very similar to the SRE type shift that has happened, where you're not the one on call. Sometimes you are, but that's not your primary job. Your primary job is to help developers build an operable system. And on the left is really more around that cloud native aspect, is you want to rethink the scope of the team. Well, we have this newer team over the last sort of 10 or so, 5 to 10 years, titled cloud security. And cloud security, it has a bit of a built-in identity crisis to it. On one aspect, it is the evolution of IT security. It's the evolution of securing your data center. Now you're securing the thing that's in the cloud, as well as some of its cloud-specific attributes. On the other side, you have all of these aspects of infrastructure that have moved into the app, and they need to be application security minded. And so it's a tricky proposition. The industry hasn't quite decided where it is, but my advice would be to think about expanding the scope of your application security team, which has historically been deemed more, your code and your libraries, maybe sort of securing those, to more of a product security team. And that includes the full set of products, whatever that includes. It includes a bunch of these layers. It includes security features. That view should help you, first of all, centralize and think about those IT security aspects as parts of the app, or infrastructure security aspects as part of the app, but also it would help you empathize and be closer in your perspective to the engineering teams that you are supporting. The second thing is to rethink priorities. So most AppSec programs start from some, SAST, IS, DAST, type, 4-letter combo. And when you stop to think about it, the vast majority of those is to find vulnerabilities in your code. And that's okay, that's legit, because up until not that long ago, that was the primary job of developers. So AppSec was primarily about vulnerabilities in your code. As we just discussed, that is no longer the case. Now there's a broader scope. So you want to pause and think, given the full scope of cloud native AppSec, which threats am I most likely to be breached by? Is it more likely that I'll be breached by a vulnerability in my custom code, or by an insecure piece of infrastructure, right? Or an unpatched vulnerability or unpatched library? So the decisions would be yours, and they vary. But what I would say is pause, think about the full scope. Now it's going to be the same developers, the same dev time going to fix a container security vulnerability will come at the expense of fixing a code vulnerability, and vice versa. So you want to think about your priorities a bit more holistically. And then last, and this is after you've formed your perspective and you've formed your structure, you want to rethink the tooling. And I've already kind of harped on a bunch of this, so I don't want to boil the ocean too much here, but I would say first, think about tools in the context of developer tools and judge whatever solution you're building or buying towards that effect. Second is think about the platform scope. Yes, you can look for if you're looking for a platform, if you want to minimize vendors, you can look for a platform that has the classic DAST, all the sort of AST acronyms in it. But I would say you'd be well served by thinking about the full scope of everything you want your developers to deal with, and think about a platform that supports that full scope. And then the third, and it's more subtle, and you're going to have to make a judgment call, is to say, look at the solutions you're building or buying and say, what's the governance approach that they support? Are they focusing on, hey, you're a security person, you found a vulnerability, how do you then communicate it back to your developers? Or do they focus on, hey, you're a security person, how can you help your developers find those issues themselves and deal with them themselves? And how do you govern their activity? And of course, subsequently, how does this system help those developers handle those security concerns? And so just pause and think about tools, not based on the old models, but rather based on the new scope and the new approach you're hopefully embracing. So that's basically it for me, right? We talked about security transformation to match digital transformation. It's a must for everybody because everybody's undergoing digital transformation, and every large company wants to be able to work, to have independent development teams work as nimbly as that sort of new scrappy startup. And those independent teams, they require dev-first security solutions. We have to think about our solutions in a different fashion. You want to make sure that you apply AppSec to the full cloud-native AppSec scope, including those previously IT layers, and you want to rethink your organization, your security org, your priorities, and your tooling to match this world. And if you do all of those well, you get a chance to profit. You get a chance to be better than the competition, and you get a chance for security to be an enabler for security to benefit, the way DevOps did from a more builder mentality, from a more builder appreciation in your organization, and be seen as something that helps the organization thrive versus just managing some side risk. So good luck.